The fire never stops. Even when the promethium runs dry and the last heretic falls silent, the fire continues inside their skulls, behind their eyes, burning through the quiet hours when no enemy presents itself for righteous destruction. Sister Margot Valerius learned this truth, not on the killing field or in the ashen wastes of some forgotten agri-world, but in the stillness of her own cell, 3 hours past midnight, when the only sound was her own breathing and the distant hum of the convent's climate regulators. The fire never stops, and that is the first sin they never speak of: the addiction to purpose, the hunger for validation through violence, the terrible secret that without an enemy to burn, some sisters do not know who they are. The convent of the Weeping Rose sits on a plateau overlooking the hive sprawl of Sanctum Primus, a fortress monastery carved from black granite and reinforced with consecrated ceramite, its spires crowned with shrines that cast long shadows across the prayer courtyards below. From the outside, it appears exactly as the propagandists would have it: austere, impregnable, a monument to unwavering faith and martial discipline. The banners hang motionless in the still air, embroidered with icons of Saint Catherine and the martyrs whose names every sister can recite from memory. The walls are thick enough to withstand orbital bombardment, the gates blessed by 3 different cardinals over the span of 5 centuries. But walls that keep enemies out also keep secrets in, and within the Weeping Rose, beneath the layers of ritual and routine, there exists a world the Imperium does not acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that even the most faithful can falter, that even the Emperor's chosen daughters are still human, and humanity is a flaw that cannot be burned away, no matter how many prayers are offered or how many purity seals are pressed against scarred flesh. Sister Margot's day begins at 4:30 in the morning, 30 minutes before matins, because she cannot sleep. She has not slept properly in 8 months. Not since the Castover campaign, where her squad held a basilica against a tide of cultists for 6 days without resupply, subsisting on corpse starch and recycled water from their armor's filtration systems. They won, of course. They always win, or they die, and death is simply another form of victory when it comes in service to the God Emperor. But victory left something behind in her mind, a residue like the carbon scoring on her Balkan's barrel, a stain that will not wash clean. She dresses in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on the simple black body glove that every sister wears beneath their armor, then the white robe that marks her as a battle sister rather than a novitiate or one of the administrative orders. The fabric is rough against her skin, deliberately uncomfortable, a reminder that comfort is a luxury the faithful do not require. She fastens her rosarius around her neck, feeling the weight of the prayer beads and the tiny reliquary containing a fragment of bone from some long-dead saint whose name has been lost to time, but whose sanctity remains certified by the Ecclesiarchy. Then she kneels on the stone floor of her cell, not on the prayer cushion provided for such purposes, but directly on the cold granite, and she begins the Litany of Dawn. The words come automatically, carved into her memory through decades of repetition. Emperor, protect us from the darkness without and the darkness within. Grant us strength to face the heretic, the mutant, the alien. Let our faith be our shield and our fury be our sword. But even as she speaks them, part of her mind wanders. She thinks about Sister Helena, 2 cells down the corridor, who stopped eating 4 weeks ago and now subsists on nutrient paste administered by the convent's medica staff. Helena fought at Castover too, stood beside Margot in the firing line, sang hymns while reloading her bolt gun with fingers slick with blood. Now she weighs 43 kilograms and her eyes have retreated into dark hollows, and when anyone asks her why she will not eat, she says only that she is fasting, that the Emperor requires her purity, that food is an indulgence she no longer deserves. The canoness has mandated the nutrient paste, overriding Helena's protests. But everyone in the convent understands what is happening, and no one speaks of it, because to speak of it would be to acknowledge that faith can become sickness, that devotion can twist into self-destruction, and these truths are darker than any heresy because they come from within. The chapel bell tolls once, a deep bronze voice that reverberates through the stone corridors, and Margot rises from her devotions. Her knees ache. She is 37 years old, which makes her ancient by the standards of the Order's militant, a veteran who has survived campaigns that killed sisters half her age. Her body is a map of violence, las-burn scars on her left shoulder, 3 parallel claw marks down her right thigh from a ginastela that got too close on Hephaestus primed, a twisted knot of scar tissue where a piece of shrapnel punched through her lower abdomen and had to be dug out with a combat knife, because the medica servitor had been destroyed. She does not think of herself as scarred. The word implies damage, diminishment, and each mark on her flesh is a badge of service, a testament to survival. But sometimes, in moments like this, she wonders what she would look like without them. If the girl who entered the Schola Progenium at age 7 would recognize the woman she has become. The corridor outside her cell is already filling with sisters making their way to the main chapel. They move in silence, as is proper, their footsteps creating a soft rhythm against the stone floors. Margot falls into step with them, anonymous in her white robe, just another faceless soldier in the Emperor's army. But she is not faceless, not truly. She knows each woman in this procession, knows their names and their histories, the campaigns they have survived and the sisters they have lost. Sister Tabitha, 3 paces ahead, who laughs too loudly during recreation hours and collects pressed flowers from every world she visits, keeping them in a locked box beneath her cot. Sister Vane, walking with a slight limp from an injury that never quite healed, who writes poetry in margins of her prayer books and thinks no one has noticed. Sister Drusilla, the youngest of their group, barely 21, who still flinches at loud noises and wakes screaming twice a week from nightmares about the massacre at her home world that left her the sole survivor of her family. These are her sisters in more than just title, bound together by shared trauma and shared purpose, and yet each is utterly alone inside her own skull, fighting private battles that no bolter can address. The main chapel is a cavern of cold light and incense smoke. The walls rise 30 meters to a vaulted ceiling decorated with frescoes depicting the Emperor's great victories, his conquest of the galaxy, his battle against Horus on the vengeful spirit, his eternal vigil on the golden throne. The imagery is meant to inspire, to remind them of the stakes, but Margot has stared at these paintings for so long that they have become wallpaper, background noise to her devotions. She takes her place in the 3rd row, between Tabitha and Vane, and as the canoness ascends to the pulpit, 500 sisters lower themselves to their knees in perfect synchronization, a wave of white fabric and bowed heads. Canoness Severina is 73 years old and looks 50, her face preserved by Juvenat treatments and an iron will that has kept her alive through conflicts that have consumed entire sector fleets. Her voice carries across the chapel without amplification, sharp and clear as a blade. "We are the Emperor's daughters," she begins, the traditional opening to Matins. "We are his fury made manifest, his mercy extended to the faithful, his judgment delivered to the unworthy. We ask nothing for ourselves, seek no glory but his, desire no reward but the privilege of service." The congregation responds in unison, voices blending into a single sound that seems to come from the walls themselves. "We are the burning flame that cleanses. We are the shield that protects. We are the sword that smites." And then comes the silence, the moment of personal prayer, when each sister is meant to commune with the Emperor directly, to offer up her doubts and fears and receive his guidance. Margot closes her eyes and tries to pray, but the words will not come. Instead, she thinks about the cultist at Castova, the young woman who could not have been older than 19, who had come at Margot with a crude autopistol and a scream of defiance. Margot had shot her once, sent a mass, the blessed bolt around punching through her sternum and detonating inside her chest cavity. The cultist had looked surprised, just for a moment, before she fell, and in that moment Margot had seen not a heretic but a girl, someone's daughter, someone who had been failed by the Imperium so completely that she had turned to the ruinous powers out of desperation or ignorance, or some combination of both. The kill was righteous. The cultist had chosen her path, and the Emperor's judgment had been delivered through Margot's hands. But Margot cannot stop seeing that expression, that flash of surprise, and she wonders sometimes late at night If the cultist had expected to die for her beliefs, or if she had thought, somehow, that her faith in the dark gods would protect her. Faith is a strange thing. It can sustain you through horrors that should break any rational mind, or it can lead you to your death with a smile on your lips, and Margot is no longer certain there is as much difference between the two as the Ecclesiarchy insists. The moment of silence ends. The canoness leads them through the litany of hate, then the hymn of Saint Celestine, then a reading from the Fide Imperialis that details the martyrdom of Sebastian Thor. The service lasts 90 minutes, and when it finally concludes, Margot's knees are numb and her back aches from holding the proper posture. They file out in the same silence they entered, and the day's routine begins in earnest. 2 hours of physical training in the practice cages, breakfast in the refectory, weapons maintenance, tactical briefings, more prayer. Everything is scheduled, every minute accounted for, because idle hands and idle minds are vulnerabilities that the enemy can exploit. The sisterhood does not allow for boredom or introspection beyond the prescribed moments of devotion. Even their recreation hours are structured, designated times when they are permitted to engage in approved activities like hymn composition or the study of military history, or, in Tabitha's case, pressing flowers and pretending she is doing something theological with them. But structure is not the same as prevention, and beneath the surface of routine, the convent of the Weeping Rose seethes with unspoken tensions. In the practice cages, Sister Mortana swings her power maul with a fury that goes beyond training, hitting the combat servitor targets again and again even after they have stopped functioning, until Sister Superior Constanza has to physically restrain her and demand she report to the hospitaller for evaluation. Mortana goes silent and shaking, and everyone pretends not to notice, because noticing would mean confronting the fact that Mortana has been spiraling since the Gast IV deployment, where she watched her entire squad immolated by a flamer malfunction that should never have happened, where she survived only because she had stopped to reload and was 5 paces behind when the Prometheum ignited. Survivor's guilt is not a concept the Ecclesiarchy acknowledges in its doctrine. You live or you die, and if you live, it is because the Emperor willed it, and to question his will is to flirt with heresy. But guilt does not care about doctrine, and Mortana carries hers like a second armor, invisible but suffocating. Breakfast is corpse starch porridge flavored with synthetic protein and vitamin supplements, served in metal bowls at long tables where the sisters eat in the same silence that governs most of their existence. Margot sits with her usual group, the survivors of Castovar, and they eat mechanically, refueling their bodies without pleasure or complaint. The food tastes like paste and regret, but it provides the necessary calories and nutrients, and that is sufficient. Across the table, Sister Vane pushes her food around her bowl without eating much, and Margot makes a mental note to mention this to the hospitaller later, because Vane's weight has been dropping steadily, and if she follows Helena's path, then the convent will lose another capable soldier to an enemy that cannot be shot. But Margot says nothing now, does not ask if Yvain is well, because such questions invite answers that neither of them is permitted to voice. After breakfast comes weapons maintenance, and Margot retreats to the armory where her Balkan waits in its consecrated rack. She has carried this weapon for 13 years, since her elevation from the Order of the Sacred Rose to full battle sister status, and it has never failed her. She field strips it with practiced efficiency, laying out the components on a clean cloth barrel, bolt assembly, firing mechanism, magazine housing. Each piece is inspected, cleaned, anointed with blessed oils, and reassembled while she recites the litany of maintenance. The work is meditative, requiring enough concentration to quiet her mind, but not so much that she cannot let her thoughts drift. And she finds herself thinking about the question that has haunted her for months. What is she when she is not fighting? Strip away the armor and the bolt gun and the prayers, and what remains? Who is Margot Valerius beneath the title of Battle Sister? The answer should be simple. She is the Emperor's servant, his instrument, his weapon. Her purpose is to fight his enemies and die in his service if necessary, and anything beyond that is irrelevant. But the answer does not satisfy her anymore, if it ever did, because she has seen too many sisters whose entire identity was wrapped up in combat collapse when combat ended, who could not function during the long stretches between deployments, who became ghosts haunting the convent's corridors, waiting for the next war to give them meaning again. She has seen sisters volunteer for suicide missions not out of faith but out of desperation, seeking death because it was preferable to the emptiness of peace. And she wonders, sometimes, if she is any different, if her inability to sleep and her constant need to be doing something useful are just symptoms of the same disease that has consumed Helena and Mortana and so many others. The Vox grill in the armory crackles to life, and a flat mechanical voice announces, "Sister Margot Valerius, report to the canoness's sanctum immediately." The other sisters look up from their weapons, curious and concerned, because a private summons to the canoness is rarely good news. Margot sets down her bolt gun, wipes the oil from her hands, and makes her way through the convent's corridors to the administrative wing, where the canoness maintains her office. The door is heavy ironwood bound with brass, carved with scenes of martyrdom and triumph. She knocks twice and enters when bidden. Canoness Severina sits behind a desk piled high with data slates and parchment scrolls, the administrative detritus of running a military order in an Imperium that values documentation above efficiency. She looks up as Margot enters, her augmetic left eye clicking as it refocuses. "Close the door," she says, and Margot obeys. "Sit." Margot sits. The canoness studies her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then says, "You are being reassigned." The words land like a punch to the gut. Reassignment can mean many things, from a routine transfer to another order, to a penitent crusade, to a quiet acknowledgement that you are no longer fit for combat, and will spend the rest of your days in administrative service. Margot keeps her face neutral and waits for the canoness to continue. The preceptory of Saint Arabella on Tharsos 4 has requested an experienced battle sister to serve as liaison to the local Ecclesiarchy. Severina says, her tone carefully neutral. The planet is stable, no active combat zones, but there are concerns about heretical activity among the lower hive populations. Your role would be investigatory and diplomatic rather than martial. You would be working with abbots, inquisitorial acolytes, and local clergy to identify threats before they require military intervention. She pauses, then adds, "I recommended you for this assignment." Margot processes this information slowly. Tharsos 4 is a mid-tier industrial world, productive but unremarkable, the kind of place where the Imperium's machinery grinds along without drama or distinction. It is not a battlefield. It is not a crusade. It is a desk job dressed up as fieldwork, a gentle way of removing a veteran from active combat and putting her somewhere she cannot hurt herself or others. "Am I being punished, canoness?" she asks, keeping her voice level. Severina's expression softens just slightly. "No, sister. You are being preserved. You have given the Emperor 30 years of service and survived battles that killed better-equipped soldiers. You have earned the right to serve in a capacity that does not require you to throw yourself at the enemy over and over until your luck runs out." She leans forward, folding her hands on the desk. "I have lost too many good sisters to the war inside their own heads, Margot. I will not lose you to that if I can prevent it. This assignment will give you time to rest, to remember who you are beyond the trigger pull, to serve the Emperor in a different way. Will you accept it?" The question is rhetorical. In the sisterhood you do not refuse assignments, but the way Severina asks it, with something approaching compassion, makes it clear that this is not a punishment but an act of mercy, and Margot finds herself nodding before she fully realizes what she is agreeing to. "I will serve where the Emperor wills," she says, the formal response, and Severina nods in approval. "You leave in 3 days. Use the time to prepare." Dismissed. Margot rises, salutes, and leaves the sanctum, her mind churning. In 3 days she will leave the only home she has known for decades, leave behind her sisters in arms, leave behind the routine and structure that have defined her existence. She should feel afraid, or at least apprehensive. Instead, she feels nothing at all, just a cold emptiness that might be relief or might be dread, and she cannot tell the difference anymore. The next 3 days pass in a blur of farewells and preparations. She packs her sparse belongings, a few changes of clothing, her rosarius and prayer beads, a battered copy of the Fide Imperialis that she received upon taking her vows, a small wooden box containing 3 bullets, each one recovered from the body of a sister she could not save. She does not pack her armor or her bolt gun. Those will remain with the convent, to be used by whoever replaces her in the firing line. The thought of someone else wearing her armor, carrying her weapon, is strange and unsettling, like watching a stranger wear her skin, but she pushes the feeling aside. Attachment to material objects is a weakness. The armor and weapon are tools, nothing more, and she has been reassigned to work that does not require them. Sister Tabitha finds her on the last evening, knocking softly on her cell door and entering without waiting for permission. She sits on the edge of Margot's cot and says nothing for a long time, just stares at the wall with an expression that might be sadness or might be envy. Finally, she speaks. "Are you afraid?" Margot considers the question. "I do not know what I am," she admits. "I should be grateful. The canoness is giving me a chance to serve without dying. But I feel like I am being sent into exile, like I am being removed from the only place I have ever belonged." She looks at Tabitha. "Does that make me weak?" Tabitha shakes her head. "It makes you human. The Ecclesiarchy would have us believe that we transcend humanity when we take our vows, that we become something more, but we do not. We are still women, still capable of fear and doubt and loneliness. We just learn to hide it better." She reaches into her pocket and pulls out a small pressed flower, a delicate blue bloom that Margot does not recognize. "From Castavar," Tabitha says quietly. "I found it growing in the ruins of the basilica after we retook the city. It should not have been there. Nothing should have been growing in all that ash and blood. But there it was, this tiny perfect thing, refusing to die." She presses the flower into Margot's hand. "Take it with you. Let it remind you that survival is not a sin, and that sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is allow ourselves to live." Margot looks at the flower, this fragile scrap of color preserved between wax paper, and something inside her chest tightens and then releases. She closes her fingers around it gently, afraid of crushing it, and nods. "Thank you," she whispers, and Tabitha smiles, sad and knowing, and leaves without another word. The transport shuttle departs at dawn. Margot stands in the embarkation bay with her single duffel bag, watching as sisters move through their morning routines, and she feels like a ghost, already gone even though she has not yet left. The shuttle's pilot is a servitor, lobotomized and hardwired into the ship's control systems, incapable of conversation or distraction. She straps into a crash seat and watches through the viewport as the convent of the Weeping Rose grows smaller and smaller, until it is just another grey structure on the plateau, indistinguishable from the manufactorums and hab blocks that surround it. Then the clouds swallow them, and it is gone. Tharsos 4 is exactly as mundane as she expected. The preceptory is a small compound attached to a larger cathedral complex in the upper levels of Hive Primaris, administrative buildings and living quarters arrayed around a modest chapel that seats maybe 200 people. The staff consists of a dozen sisters from the Order Dialogus, whose mission is scholarship and translation rather than combat, and a rotating contingent of priests and functionaries from the local Ecclesiarchy. Margot is greeted by Sister Superior Odessa, a severe woman in her 50s with grey streaked hair and a voice like gravel, who gives her a brief tour of the facilities and explains her duties. "You will attend meetings with the city's Arbits Precinct and the Inquisitorial Liaison Office," Odessa says as they walk through the preceptory's library, a room lined with shelves of ancient books and more modern data slates. "You will review reports of potential heretical activity and determine which cases warrant investigation. You will provide counsel to the local clergy on matters of doctrine and security, and you will represent the Adepta Sororitas at official functions, because apparently the Ecclesiarchy believes that having a battle sister present lends credibility to their ceremonies." Her tone makes it clear what she thinks of this last duty. "In short, you will be bored out of your mind, but you will be useful, and usefulness is a form of devotion." She is correct on both counts. The work is tedious, an endless parade of reports and meetings and ceremonies, but it is undeniably useful. Margot spends her days reviewing intelligence gathered by Arbit's informants and inquisitorial agents, sifting through rumors and accusations to identify genuine threats. Most of it is noisy workers complaining about labor conditions, petty crimes dressed up as heresy by accusers with personal grudges, the usual background radiation of discontent that exists in any hive city. But occasionally there are real concerns. A hab block where several residents have disappeared, a preacher whose sermons have started to drift toward dangerous territory, a black market dealer selling books that the Ecclesiarchy has deemed forbidden. These cases she passes to the appropriate authorities, and sometimes she accompanies Arbit's squads on raids, not to fight but to provide religious authority, to declare seized materials heretical and subject to destruction, to reassure frightened citizens that the Emperor still watches over them. It is strange work, alien to everything she is trained for, but she finds herself adapting to it. The skills that made her an effective soldier translate surprisingly well to investigation, attention to detail, the ability to read people and situations, a willingness to make hard decisions quickly, and the diplomatic aspects, which she initially dreaded, prove less onerous than expected. The local clergy treat her with a deference that borders on fear, which makes negotiations straightforward, and the Arbits respect her because she does not waste their time with theological debates when a simple answer will suffice. She establishes a routine, mornings reviewing reports in the preceptory's library, afternoons attending meetings or conducting field investigations, evenings in the chapel for prayers and meditation. It is not combat. It is not the adrenaline rush of standing in the firing line while heretics scream and die around you. But it is service, and service has its own kind of satisfaction. 3 months into her assignment, she receives a case that changes everything. A young woman named Sebastine Carth has been arrested by the Arbits for distributing seditious literature in the lower hive. The literature in question consists of pamphlets arguing that the Imperium has failed its citizens, that the Emperor's vision of unity and prosperity has been corrupted by bureaucracy and greed, that the common people deserve better than grinding poverty and endless war. It is heresy of a sort, but not the usual chaos-tainted filth. There are no prayers to the dark gods, no promises of power or transformation, just anger and desperation translated into words. The Arbits want to execute her as an example, but the case has been flagged for review by the inquisitorial liaison, and that review falls to Margot. She reads the pamphlets in the quiet of her cell, late at night when the preceptory is silent. The writing is crude but passionate, the arguments poorly formed but sincere. Sebastine Carth is not a heretic in the traditional sense. She has not turned to chaos or alien idolatry. She has simply looked at the world around her and found it wanting, and she has dared to say so out loud. The Imperium does not tolerate such dissent. Doubt is a weapon that the enemy can exploit, and even justified criticism must be silenced to maintain the unity that keeps humanity alive. Margot knows this. She has spent her life enforcing this. But as she reads Sebastine's words, she finds herself thinking about the cultist at Castova, that flash of surprise before she died, and she wonders how many of the Imperium's enemies started just like this, with legitimate grievances that were ignored or suppressed until desperation drove them into the arms of something darker. The interrogation takes place in an Arbit's detention cell, a grey box lit by harsh lumen strips and monitored by vid-capture servitors. Sebastine Carth is 23 years old, thin to the point of emaciation, with hollow eyes and bruises on her wrists where the restraints have bitten into her flesh. She looks at Margot without fear, which is unusual. Most people confronted by a sister of battle react with either terror or awe, but Sebastine's expression is something closer to curiosity. "Are you here to kill me?" she asks, her voice flat. Margot sits across the table from her and folds her hands. "That depends on what you tell me. The Arbits believe you are spreading heresy. I am here to determine if they are correct." She gestures to the stack of pamphlets on the table between them. "Did you write these?" Sebastine nods. "Yes." "Why?" The girl blinks, surprised by the question. "Because someone needed to. Because people are suffering and dying, and the Imperium pretends not to notice. Because the factories down in the underhive are killing workers with toxic fumes and no one cares. Because the tithe collectors take more grain every year and children are starving. Because the priests tell us to have faith and trust the Emperor, but faith does not feed empty bellies. She leans forward, her voice rising. I believe in the Emperor. I pray to him every day. But I do not believe that his Imperium, the way it exists now, is what he wanted for us. I do not believe he intended for billions to suffer so that a few can live in comfort. And saying that should not be heresy. Margot listens, her face impassive, and when Sebastian finishes, she asks, "What would you have me do? Declare your words righteous, and let you go free to continue spreading them." The Imperium's unity is fragile, held together by faith and fear. Your pamphlets undermine that faith. They give people permission to doubt, and doubt is a door that opens onto damnation. I have seen what happens when people lose faith in the Emperor. I have fought the cultists and traitors they become. How do I know you are not the first step down that path? Sebastian meets her gaze steadily. You do not. But I have seen what happens when people lose hope, when they are ground down so completely that they stop caring whether they live or die. Despair is just as dangerous as heresy, sister. Maybe more because it is quieter. People who have given up do not rebel. They just fade away, and the Imperium replaces them with new bodies to feed into the machine. Is that what the Emperor wants? An empire of ghosts? The question hangs in the air between them, and Margot does not have an answer. She thinks about Helena, starving herself in pursuit of a purity she can never achieve. She thinks about Mortana, drowning in guilt because she survived when others died. She thinks about herself, sleepless and hollow, measuring her worth by the number of enemies she has killed. Despair is just as dangerous as heresy. The words echo in her mind long after the interrogation ends. She submits her report to the inquisitorial liaison 3 days later. In it, she concludes that Sebastian Karth is guilty of sedition, but not heresy, that her writings reflect legitimate grievances rather than chaos corruption, and that executing her would create a martyr without addressing the underlying issues that drove her to dissent. She recommends a sentence of penance labor rather than death, with mandatory re-education in the faith. It is the most lenient recommendation she can justify, and she has no idea if it will be accepted. The Inquisition does not explain its decisions, and she may have simply delayed Sebastian's execution rather than prevented it. But she has done what she believes is right, and that is all she can control. The response comes 2 weeks later, delivered by a servo skull that deposits a sealed data slate on her desk. The message is brief. Your recommendation has been accepted. Sebastian Karth will be remanded to penitent labor under Ecclesiarchy's supervision. Your insight is noted and appreciated. It is signed with an inquisitorial seal, no name, just a stylized. That could belong to anyone. Margot stares at the message for a long time, and then she deletes it and goes to the chapel to pray. The months roll past, one after another, a steady rhythm of work and prayer and quiet contemplation. Margot settles into her role, becomes a fixture in the preceptory and the surrounding community. She adjudicates disputes between priests, advises abbots on the religious dimensions of their cases, and occasionally accompanies missionaries into the lower hive to provide protection and credibility. She discovers that she is good at this work, better than she expected, and that there is satisfaction in preventing violence rather than inflicting it. She saves lives not by killing the Emperor's enemies, but by identifying threats before they become crises, by finding solutions that do not require blood. It is not the life she imagined for herself when she took her vows all those years ago, but it is a life, and it has meaning. She thinks less about Castava now. The nightmares have faded, not gone but less frequent, and she sleeps better, most nights managing 5 or 6 hours without waking in a cold sweat. She corresponds with Tabitha, brief messages carried by astropathic relay, and learns that Helena has recovered enough to return to light duties, that Mortana has requested a transfer to a penitent crusade and been granted it, that the Convent of the Weeping Rose continues as it always has, training new sisters and sending them out to fight and die in the Emperor's name. The letters are a lifeline, a reminder that she has not been forgotten, that she is still part of something larger than herself, even though she is no longer in the firing line. One evening, almost a year into her assignment, she is walking through the cathedral plaza after a meeting with the city's administratum liaison when she sees a woman selling flowers from a small stall. The flowers are simple things, grown in rooftop gardens somewhere in the upper hive, but they are alive and colorful and utterly out of place in the grey industrial sprawl. Margot stops and stares at them, thinking of Tabitha's pressed flower, still tucked away in the wooden box with her bullets and prayer beads. On impulse, she buys a single bloom, a red carnation that the vendor assures her is freshly cut. She carries it back to the preceptory and places it in a small glass of water on the windowsill of her cell. It is a frivolous thing, an indulgence that serves no practical purpose, but looking at it makes her feel something she has not felt in a long time: hope. Sister Superior Odessa notices the flower during an inspection and raises an eyebrow but says nothing. Later that evening, Margot finds a second glass on her windowsill, containing a white lily. There is no note, no explanation, but the message is clear. She is not alone in her small rebellion against the austerity that defines their lives. The flowers become a tradition. Every week, she buys a new bloom, and every week, someone else in the preceptory leaves a flower of their own in her cell, or in the chapel, or on the library's reading tables. It is a quiet acknowledgement of their shared humanity, a reminder that they are more than soldiers and functionaries, that beauty and hope are not sins to be purged but gifts to be cherished. The work continues. She investigates a cult operating in the lower hive, a group worshipping a minor deity they call the Provider, who turns out to be nothing more sinister than a local ganglord redistributing stolen food to the hungry. She arrests the ganglord, but she also files a report with the administratum recommending increased food distribution in the affected areas, because hunger is the real heresy here, the failure of the Imperium to care for its own. She mediates a dispute between two rival preachers, both of whom claim to speak the Emperor's truth, but who are really just fighting over congregation tithers. She spends 3 weeks helping the Arbits dismantle a smuggling ring that was trafficking in xenotech, and in the process she discovers that one of the smugglers is a former guardsman who turned to crime after being discharged for injuries sustained in service. She ensures he receives medical treatment and a pension before he is sentenced, a small mercy that changes nothing in the grand scheme of the Imperium, but which matters to one broken man. These are the unseen victories, the quiet triumphs that will never be recorded in the Ecclesiarchy's grand chronicles or celebrated in hymns. No one will write songs about Margot Valerius preventing a riot by ensuring food distribution, or saving a man's life by securing him medical care. There are no medals for reducing heresy through compassion rather than bolter fire. But she has come to understand that this work is no less vital than what she did on the battlefield. Perhaps more so, because every person she helps is one less potential recruit for the forces of chaos, one less soul lost to despair and corruption. The Emperor protects, the prayers say, but protection comes in many forms, and sometimes it looks like paperwork and negotiations and small acts of mercy that add up over time into something larger. She receives a letter from Tabitha on the 2nd anniversary of her arrival on Thyrsos 4. The message is longer than usual, written on actual parchment rather than transmitted by data slate, and the handwriting is shaky in places, as though Tabitha had been uncertain what to say or how to say it. The convent is quieter now, she writes. We have lost so many in the past year. Sister Vane died on Coronis Prime, killed by a sniper before we even made planetfall. Sister Drusilla took her vows of extremis and walked into an orc horde alone, singing hymns until they tore her apart. She was smiling, they wanted to die. I do not know what to do with that information, Margot. I do not know how to grieve for someone who chose death when they could have lived. The letter continues for several more paragraphs, detailing deaths and deployments, the slow attrition of the women Margot once served beside. Then, at the end, I envy you sometimes. You found a way to serve without destroying yourself. The rest of us are still trapped in the machine, and I fear it will grind us all to dust before we are done. Take care of yourself, sister. Someone should survive this with their soul intact. Margot reads the letter 3 times, and then she folds it carefully and places it in her wooden box with the other relics of her past. She thinks about Vaint, who wrote poetry in the margins of prayer books, and Drusilla, who woke screaming from nightmares and found peace only in death. She thinks about all the sisters she has known who could not find a way to exist outside of combat, who defined themselves so completely by their role as the Emperor's weapons that when the fighting stopped, they had nothing left. The sisterhood does not prepare them for this. The training is all about warfare and faith, how to kill efficiently and die righteously. But there is nothing about how to live, how to carry the weight of violence without being crushed by it, how to be human when humanity is treated as a weakness to overcome. She begins to write responses to Tabitha's letters, longer and more personal than before, and in those responses she tries to articulate the things she has learned since leaving the convent of the Weeping Rose. She writes about the investigation work, about finding meaning in prevention rather than destruction. She writes about the flowers on her windowsill and the small acts of rebellion that keep her grounded. She writes about Sebastine Carth and the question of whether despair is more dangerous than heresy, and how she has come to believe that faith without hope is just another form of slow death. She does not know if these letters will help Tabitha, or if they will even make sense to someone still living in the heart of the war machine. But she writes them anyway, because silence is complicity, and she will not be complicit in the destruction of her sisters. The years accumulate. Margot turns 40, then 42, growing older in a way that few battle sisters do, because few survive long enough. Her hair begins to grey at the temples, and the scars on her body ache in cold weather, and she finds herself moving more stiffly in the mornings until she has completed her devotional exercises. She is becoming old by the standards of her order, a veteran whose best days of combat are behind her, but she does not feel diminished. She feels, instead, like she is finally growing into the person she was meant to be, someone who can wield authority without cruelty, who can dispense justice without vengeance, who can serve the Emperor through preservation rather than destruction. She trains the preceptory's younger sisters in hand-to-hand combat, passing on the skills she learned in decades of warfare. But she also teaches them things that are not in any training manual: how to read a room, how to de-escalate a confrontation without firing a shot, how to distinguish between genuine threats and desperate people making bad choices. Sister Odessa watches these lessons with approval, occasionally adding her own insights, and Margot realizes that she has become a teacher, another role she never imagined for herself, but which feels right in ways that combat never entirely did. The inquisitorial liaison requests her assistance on a sensitive case, and she spends 3 months embedded with an inquisitor named Convent, who is investigating a suspected Ginastela cult in the lower hive. The work is dangerous in a different way than combat, requiring subtlety and patience, and Margot finds herself enjoying it despite the constant tension. They identify the cult's meeting places, track the spread of infection through family lines, and coordinate with the Arbits to conduct simultaneous raids that decapitate the organization before it can metastasize. Covenant is impressed enough to offer her a position as a full-time acolyte, but Margot declines. She has found her calling here on Tharsos 4, in the unglamorous work of keeping one small piece of the Imperium functional, and she is not ready to give that up. She officiates at weddings and funerals, standing in the cathedral wearing her white robe and rosarius, speaking the words that bind couples together or commend the dead to the Emperor's care. These ceremonies are part of her diplomatic duties, representing the Adepta Sororitas at public events, but they become something more than obligation. She sees the hope in the eyes of newly married couples, young people starting their lives together despite the grinding horror of the Imperium. And she sees the grief of families burying loved ones, the need for reassurance that their suffering has meaning. She cannot offer them easy answers or false comfort, but she can give them presence, the acknowledgement that their lives matter to someone beyond themselves. and that acknowledgement is a form of ministry that the Ecclesiarchy rarely emphasizes but which is desperately needed. One funeral stays with her. A factory worker named Matthias Cole, killed in an industrial accident, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. The family is too poor to afford a proper ceremony, so the Ecclesiarchy provides a basic service, and Margot presides because no one else is available. She expects it to be routine. Another death in a galaxy that produces millions every day. But when she arrives at the small chapel where the ceremony will be held, she finds it packed with mourners, workers from the same factory who have come to pay their respects. They are exhausted, grey-faced from labor and malnutrition, but they have come anyway, and their presence speaks to the kind of man Matthias was, someone who mattered to the people around him. She delivers the standard funeral oration, the prayers and benedictions prescribed by the Ecclesiarchy, but then she adds something not in the liturgy. She talks about how the emperor values all his servants, from the greatest Lord Commander to the lowest factory worker, and how Matthias's labor was no less important than any soldier's sacrifice, because the Imperium is built on such labor, on the uncounted billions who work and suffer and die to keep the machinery of civilization turning. She talks about faith not as blind obedience, but as the determination to continue living and working and caring for one another, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. And when she finishes, there is not a dry eye in the chapel, and Matthias's widow approaches her afterward and says, "Thank you for seeing him. Thank you for making him matter." The words haunt Margot for days afterward. Thank you for making him matter. As though the default assumption is that he did not, that his life and death were insignificant, just more grist for the Imperium's mill. And she realizes that this is the darkest sin of all, not the violence or the fanaticism or the moments of doubt, but the casual dehumanization, the way the Imperium treats people as resources to be expended rather than souls to be valued. The Sisters of Battle are not immune to this sin. They perpetuate it every time they reduce their enemies to targets, every time they justify atrocities as necessary for the greater good, every time they measure their worth solely in kill counts and campaigns won. She has been guilty of it herself. Seeing the cultists and heretics, she killed as things rather than people, refusing to acknowledge their humanity because acknowledging it would make the killing harder. But here in this work she is learning to see people again. Sebastine Karth was not just a heretic, but a young woman driven by hunger and desperation. The ganglord calling himself the provider was not just a criminal, but someone trying to fill a gap left by the Imperium's indifference. Matthias Cole was not just a factory worker, but a husband and father whose death left a hole in the world that no amount of prayer can fill. These recognitions do not change the fundamental nature of the Imperium or absolve anyone of their crimes, but they make the work more complicated, more human. And Margot has come to believe that this complexity is necessary, that faith without compassion is just cruelty dressed in holy language. She writes to the canoness, a long letter detailing her experiences on Thassos IV and the insights she has gained. She does not expect a response, and she does not receive one. But 6 months later she gets a message from Tabitha saying that 3 sisters from the Convent of the Weeping Rose have been assigned to similar liaison positions on other worlds, that the canoness is quietly experimenting with alternative deployments for veterans who need a break from frontline combat. It is a small change, barely noticeable in the vast machinery of the Adepta Sororitas, but it is a change, and Margot allows herself to hope that it might save lives, might give other sisters the chance to discover who they are beyond the Balkan. The 5th year of her assignment brings a crisis. A new planetary governor is appointed to Thassos IV, a young aristocrat named Valence Tross who believes that the previous administration was too lenient, that the lower hive populations need to be controlled with greater force and discipline. His first act is to increase the tithe rates by 20%. A burden that the already struggling population cannot bear. The second act is to authorize the Arbites to use lethal force against protesters. The third is to issue a decree that anyone caught distributing seditious material will be executed immediately, without trial. Margot sees disaster approaching like a slow-motion avalanche. The lower hive is already on the edge of rebellion, hunger and anger building to critical mass, and Tross's policies are accelerating the timeline. She attends a meeting with the governor and his advisors, attempting to counsel restraint, but Tross dismisses her concerns. The Imperium does not negotiate with malcontents. He says, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. They will obey or they will be punished. That is the only language they understand. She tries to explain that starvation is driving the unrest, that providing adequate food distribution would address the root cause, but he waves her away. The Ecclesiarchy's role is to provide spiritual guidance, sister, not to meddle in governance. I suggest you focus on your prayers and leave policy to those qualified to make it. She leaves the meeting furious and frightened, because she has seen this pattern before on other worlds, and she knows how it ends. The people will rise up, and the Arbits will massacre them, and then the survivors will be ripe for chaos corruption, because they will have lost all faith in the Imperium, and eventually the world will fall, and have to be reconquered at the cost of millions of lives and decades of war. All of it preventable, all of it unnecessary, but it will happen anyway because the governor is too arrogant and too stupid to see the consequences of his actions. She meets with Sister Odessa and the other members of the preceptory staff, and they discuss their options. They have no authority to countermand the governor, and any direct opposition would be seen as insubordination, potentially heresy. But they are not powerless. Sister Odessa has connections within the Ecclesiarchy hierarchy, and Margot has her contacts in the Inquisition, and together they draft a series of reports detailing the situation on Tharsos 4 and the dangers posed by Tross's policies. They send copies to the Sector Synod, to the Inquisitorial Conclave, to the Administratum's regional headquarters, to anyone who might have the authority to intervene. Then they wait, because bureaucracy moves slowly even in matters of potential heresy, and in the meantime they do what they can to mitigate the damage. Margot personally oversees the Ecclesiarchy's food distribution programs, diverting resources from other projects to increase aid to the lower hive. She coordinates with sympathetic Arbits officers to ensure that enforcement actions are measured rather than brutal, that protesters are arrested rather than killed when possible. She works 18-hour days, running herself ragged in an effort to hold the situation together until help arrives, and she is reminded viscerally of Castovar, of holding the Basilica against impossible odds, except now the enemy is not cultists, but her own government's indifference and incompetence. The breaking point comes on a cold morning when Arbits units fire on a crowd of protesters outside a grain silo, killing 47 people including 9 children. The news spreads through the lower hive like wildfire, and by afternoon the entire sector is in open revolt. The Arbits seal off the upper levels to prevent the violence from spreading. But the damage is done. Tross issues a statement blaming the protesters for their own deaths and authorizing additional force to restore order, and Margot realizes that the situation has spiraled beyond her ability to control. She receives a Vox transmission that evening, encrypted and routed through multiple relays. The voice on the other end belongs to Inquisitor Covenant. "Your reports have been reviewed," he says without preamble. "Governor Tross will be removed from office within 48 hours. In the meantime, do whatever is necessary to prevent total collapse. You have my authority to commandeer resources and personnel as needed. Make it happen, sister." The transmission ends before she can respond. 48 hours is an eternity when a city is tearing itself apart. Margot coordinates with the Arbits and the local PDF to establish aid stations in the lower hive. Distribution points for food and medicine that are protected by armed guards but explicitly framed as humanitarian rather than military. She uses her authority as a sister of battle to negotiate with the protest leaders, convincing them to accept a temporary ceasefire in exchange for guarantees that their grievances will be addressed. She bullies and cajoles and threatens, using every tool at her disposal, and somehow, impossibly, it works. The violence does not stop completely, but it de-escalates, pulled back from the brink of total catastrophe. Tross is arrested by the Inquisition on charges of gross incompetence and endangering the Imperium's stability. He protests loudly, invoking his family connections and demanding to know by what authority he is being detained. And Margot happens to be present when Covenant delivers the answer. "By the authority of the God Emperor of mankind, whose Imperium you have jeopardized through your arrogance and stupidity. You will be taken to Terra for trial, and if you are fortunate, you will be sentenced to penal servitude rather than execution." Tross goes silent, his face ashen, and Margot feels no satisfaction in his downfall, only exhaustion and relief that the crisis is ending. The new governor is a career administratum functionary named Helena Vash, a pragmatic woman in her 60s who listens to Margot's briefing on the situation and immediately implements the food distribution increases and policy reforms that Tross had rejected. Within weeks, the tensions in the lower hive begin to ease. It will take months, perhaps years, to fully heal the damage, but the worst has been prevented, and Thassos IV remains loyal to the Imperium. Covenant visits her a month later, meeting her in the preceptory's library rather than summoning her to an interrogation room. He looks tired, his face lined with stress, and when he speaks his voice lacks its usual edge. "You did well, sister. Better than I expected. You saved this world, and you did it without firing a shot. That is a rare skill in the Imperium." He pauses, studying her. "I want you to know that your reports, the ones you have been filing over the past 5 years, have been read by people at the highest levels. There is interest in your methods, in the idea that prevention can be as valuable as punishment. It is a slow process, changing institutional attitudes, but you have planted seeds. Do not underestimate the importance of that." Margot does not know what to say, so she simply nods. Covenant lingers for a moment, as though he wants to say something else, but then he stands and takes his leave, and she is alone again with her thoughts and her exhaustion, and the flowers on her windowsill that have somehow survived another week. She writes to Tabitha that night, a letter that is more stream of consciousness than coherent narrative. She describes the crisis and its resolution, the 47 dead and the thousands saved, and then she writes, "I think I understand now what the canoness was trying to give me when she sent me here. Not rest, not exile, but purpose. I thought my purpose was to kill the Emperor's enemies, and that is important, but it is not the only way to serve. There are other battles to fight, quieter ones, and they require different weapons: patience, compassion, the willingness to see people as more than targets or threats. I do not know if I am good at this, but I am learning, and I think that is enough. We are all learning, those of us who survive long enough. We are learning to be human again, to remember that the Emperor loves us not for what we can destroy, but for what we can preserve." She sends the letter and sits in the darkness of her cell, listening to the hive's distant hum, and for the first time in years she feels something close to peace. The fire still burns inside her, but it is a different kind of flame now, steadier and more controlled, a source of warmth rather than destruction. She is still a sister of battle, still the Emperor's servant, but she is also Margot Valerius, a woman with her own thoughts and feelings and values, and those two identities are no longer in conflict. The years continue to pass. She remains on Thassos IV, her temporary assignment becoming permanent through a combination of bureaucratic inertia and her own competence. The preceptory becomes her home in a way the convent of the Weeping Rose never quite was, because here she is valued not just for her ability to kill but for her judgment and experience and humanity. She trains new sisters sent from other convents, passing on the lessons she has learned. She advises governors and arbitrators and inquisitors, her opinion sought on matters ranging from heretical activity to labor disputes. She presides at ceremonies and mediates conflicts and, occasionally, when the situation demands it, she straps on her armor and picks up a bolgan and goes into combat, because some threats cannot be negotiated away and violence remains a necessary tool in the Imperium's arsenal. But violence is no longer her default response, no longer her identity. She has become something more complicated. Something that does not fit neatly into the sisterhood's traditional roles, but which is valuable nonetheless. And she knows, from the letters she receives from Tabitha and others, that she is not alone, that across the Imperium other sisters are finding their own paths, their own ways of serving that do not require them to burn themselves to ash. Tabitha visits her once, a brief stop during a deployment to a nearby system. They sit together in Margot's cell, drinking recaf and talking until the early hours of the morning, and Tabitha confesses that she has requested a transfer to liaison work, that she can no longer bear the weight of constant combat, that she needs to find a different way to serve before she breaks. Margot helps her draft the request, and when Tabitha leaves, there are tears in her eyes but also hope, and Margot thinks that maybe, just maybe, they are beginning to change the narrative, to expand the definition of what it means to be a sister of battle. She grows older, 50 years old, an age that should have been impossible for someone who took the vows she took and lived the life she lived. Her body is failing in small ways, joints that ache and scars that never quite healed and a persistent cough that the hospitalers cannot fully cure. She knows her time is limited. That age will accomplish what decades of warfare could not, but she is not afraid. She has lived, truly lived, not just survived. And she has made a difference in ways that matter. The people of Tharsos 4 know her name, and when she walks through the markets or the cathedral plaza, they greet her with respect and affection rather than fear. Children wave to her, and she waves back, and these small interactions feel more valuable than any medal or commendation. Sister Odessa dies of a stroke, quietly in her sleep, and Margot presides at her funeral, standing in the same chapel where she eulogized Matthias Cole all those years ago. She speaks about Odessa's service, her wisdom and her dedication, but she also speaks about her kindness, the way she left flowers on Margot's windowsill and taught younger sisters not just how to fight but how to think, and the assembled mourners nod in recognition, because they all have their own stories of Odessa's small mercies and unexpected compassion. Margot becomes Sister Superior of the Preceptory, a title she never sought, but which she accepts because someone needs to do the work and she is qualified. She administers the compound's operations, manages its budget, and continues the outreach programs that have become its signature. The Ecclesiarchy hierarchy notices, and she receives commendations and requests to train other liaison officers, and she realizes that the quiet experiment the canoness began all those years ago has borne fruit, that there is now an official recognition within the Adepta Sororitas that service can take many forms. On her 55th birthday, she receives a final letter from Tabitha. It is brief, just a few lines. "I am dying, Margot. Loss burned to the chest, too much damage for the hospitalers to repair. I am not afraid. I have lived well, served faithfully, and I die knowing that I made a difference. Thank you for showing me that there was another way, for giving me years I would not have had if I had stayed in combat. I count you among my greatest blessings. Remember me, sister, and keep planting flowers." The letter is dated 3 weeks earlier, and Margot knows that by the time she reads it, Tabitha is already gone. She weeps for the first time in decades, great racking sobs that shake her entire body, because Tabitha was her friend, her sister in more than just title. The person who first showed her that humanity was not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be celebrated. She weeps for all the sisters she has lost over the years, for Ravane and Drusilla and Helena, and so many others whose names she carries in her heart. And she weeps for herself, for the girl she was and the woman she has become, for all the struggles and doubts and small victories that have brought her to this moment. When the tears finally stop, she goes to her windowsill and looks at the flowers there, a small collection of blooms in various stages of life and decay. She tends them carefully, removing the dead ones and replacing them with fresh cuttings, and as she works she thinks about legacy, about what she will leave behind when her own time comes. Not a kill count or a list of campaigns, not medals or commendations or a place in the Ecclesiarchy's histories, but lives saved and people helped and a slightly better version of the Imperium, one small corner at a time. And perhaps, if she is very fortunate, a generation of sisters who understand that strength comes in many forms, that faith and compassion are not contradictions, that the Emperor's greatest gift to humanity is not the power to destroy but the capacity to endure, and to hope even in the darkest times. She returns to the chapel and lights a candle for Tabitha, adding it to the hundreds already burning for the dead and the lost and the faithful. The flames flicker in the still air, casting dancing shadows on the ancient stones, and Margot kneels and prays, not the formal litanies prescribed by the Ecclesiarchy but her own words, offered from the heart. Emperor, protect her. Give her rest, and help the rest of us find our way home, whatever that means and wherever it leads. We are your daughters, and we try to serve you as best we can, but we are human, and we falter, and we need your grace. We need to know that our struggles matter, that our lives have meaning beyond the battles we fight. Help us to see each other, to value each other, to remember that we are more than weapons. We are women, we are your children, and we deserve to live, not just to die well. The prayer hangs in the silence, unanswered as prayers often are, but Margot feels lighter nonetheless, as though by speaking the words she has released something that was trapped inside her. She rises and leaves the chapel, walking through the preceptory's corridors one last time before retiring to her cell. Tomorrow there will be more work, more cases to review and meetings to attend and people to help. There will be challenges and setbacks and small triumphs. There will be life in all its complicated, messy, beautiful reality, and somewhere, on 1,000 different worlds, other sisters of battle are discovering the same truths. Learning that faith does not require them to destroy themselves, that service can be more than violence, that they are allowed to be human even as they strive to be holy. The narrative is changing slowly and against great resistance, but it is changing. The sisterhood is evolving, and that evolution is not a betrayal of their purpose, but a fulfillment of it, because the Emperor loves not mindless automatons but thinking, feeling, choosing individuals who serve him freely rather than out of fear or conditioning. This is the darkest sin of the Sisters of Battle, and also their greatest hope, that beneath the armor and the prayers and the endless war, they are and have always been human, capable of doubt and growth and change, and that this humanity is not a flaw to be burned away, but the very thing that makes their faith meaningful, their service valuable, their lives worth living. The fire never stops, but it does not have to consume them. It can warm instead of destroy, illuminate instead of blind, and in that warmth and light they can find not just purpose but peace, not just duty but joy, not just survival but genuine life. Margot stands at her window, looking out over the hive sprawl of Thyrsos 4, and she smiles, because tomorrow she will wake and pray and work and live, and that is enough, more than enough. It is everything.